The heavy cast-iron skillet slipped from the shelf, hitting the kitchen floor with a deafening, metallic gong that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the diner. Martha froze, her breath catching in her throat as the vibration of the iron slowly died away. In the dining room, the hushed voices of the town's most powerful men stopped instantly. A suffocating silence rushed in, broken only by the faint, receding hum of the metal. Through a sliver in the swinging door, she saw the mayor's silhouette sharpen as he turned toward the kitchen, his eyes narrowing into predatory slits. The yellow light cast Martha's long, distorted shadow directly across the floor, betraying her hiding spot with agonizing clarity. She watched as the mayor's hand slowly reached for the door handle, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. Outside, the sleepy streets of Selma Creek were dark and silent. But inside the kitchen, the air grew thick with a mounting threat. One accidental sound had just turned the town's most trusted neighbor into its most dangerous witness. And as the door began to creak open, Martha realized that some secrets are loud enough to get you killed. Martha Granger moved the rag in steady, rhythmic circles, erasing the condensation rings left by morning coffee mugs. The laminated surface of the bar counter felt tacky under the cloth, smelling faintly of the lemon-scented bleach she used to keep the grime of Selma Creek at bay. Behind her, the heavy scent of sizzling bacon and the sharp, acidic aroma of dark roast coffee filled the air, a familiar perfume that had seeped into the very wood of the walls. The bell above the door gave a cheerful, brassy yelp, admitting a swirl of cool morning air along with Henry Walker. The old pharmacist, clad in his usual starch-white coat despite the early hour, shuffled to his customary corner stool. Martha didn't need to ask. She simply reached for a ceramic mug with a jagged chip on the rim, Henry's favorite, and filled it to the brim with steaming black liquid. As the old man shook out the morning edition of the local paper, the low hum of the ancient refrigerator provided a bass note to the soft murmur of the few regulars scattered among the booths. They spoke in hushed tones about the rising price of gas at the station on the edge of town, their voices blending into the background of Martha's life. She offered a tired but genuine smile to Mrs. Watkins, handing over a plate of warm blueberry pie, then paused to brush a few stray crumbs from her stained apron. Sunlight lanced through the front window, illuminating a slow-motion dance of dust motes above the glass sugar shakers, making the diner feel, for a fleeting moment, like a sanctuary frozen in time. The shadows grew long, eventually swallowing the red vinyl booths as the dinner rush faded into a heavy, expectant silence. Martha remained alone in the dimming light, the only sound the persistent, mechanical tick of the wall clock above the grill. She didn't reach for her keys to lock up. Instead, she knelt on the hard tile before the kitchen sink, her joints protesting the movement. She gripped a heavy pipe wrench, its cold iron biting into her palm. A persistent leak had been mocking her all afternoon, and now, with the town asleep, she meant to silence it. As she cranked the handle, a sudden spray of icy water erupted from the loosened nut, drenching the sleeves of her flannel shirt and leaving dark, jagged blossoms on the floor. Martha gritted her teeth, leaning her entire weight into the metal tool until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. The shriek of iron against iron echoed off the stainless steel surfaces, sharp and dissonant. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and oxidized copper. Finally, the stubborn valve yielded, the spray dying down to a pathetic drip before ceasing entirely. Martha wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a dark, greasy smear of lubricant across her brow, her breathing ragged in the quiet kitchen. The silence shattered when the heavy front door of the diner swung open with a violent wooden thud. Martha, still crouched under the sink, flinched, the wrench nearly slipping from her damp fingers. The rhythmic, authoritative click of leather heels on the linoleum floor announced an arrival that didn't belong in a closed diner. Thomas Miller strode toward the center table, his presence filling the room with a cold, calculated energy. He tossed a leather portfolio onto the table, the gold-embossed seal of the mayor's office catching the dim light. Following him like a wake of vultures, members of the city council filed in, their voices sounding unnaturally loud and jagged in the empty space. Martha watched from her hiding spot as Miller flicked a silver lighter. The tip of a cigar flared a deep, angry crimson, and a cloud of expensive, pungent tobacco smoke began to drift toward the kitchen. She froze, pressing her spine against the cold wood of the cabinet. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The men sat with the easy, sprawling confidence of those who believed they were entirely alone, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the floor. Martha squeezed into the narrow gap between the heavy industrial refrigerator and the prep table, her chest heaping as she tried to stifle the sound of her own lungs. Through a sliver of a gap in the swinging kitchen door, she watched Thomas Miller unfurl a large, glossy blueprint across the table. His long, thin fingers slid across the paper with predatory grace, hovering over bright sectors labeled the Golden Mile Mall. Miller's voice vibrated with a raw, unrestrained greed as he began to recite figures. Expected profits, construction kickbacks, and the percentage of secret cuts. Martha felt her heart thudding like a panicked bird trapped in a cage, her palms slicking with cold sweat. Every word about offshore accounts and silent investors felt like a physical blow, a serrated blade cutting through the silence of her kitchen. She gripped the edges of her apron until the fabric threatened to tear, listening to the casual destruction of the town's future. Thomas Miller took a fat red marker and drew a jagged line across the map of Selma Creek, bisecting the heart of the community with a single, arrogant stroke. Martha watched, her eyes wide and stinging, as the historic library, with its ornate stonework and generations of stories, vanished under a smear of crimson ink. The mayor's palm came down hard on the spot where her diner stood. He declared with a chilling flatness that this dilapidated junk would be the first to go, cleared away for a 300-space parking lot. The council members nodded in a synchronized bobbing motion, their faces illuminated by the flare of Miller's cigar as they discussed the efficiency of the bulldozers. They spoke of turning century-old brick into mere rubble, as if they were discussing the weather. A numbing cold spread through Martha's veins, a glacial realization that the world she had spent decades preserving was being erased by a few strokes of a felt-tip pen. Her legs felt like leaden weights, and Martha began to back away toward the rear exit, her movements slow and deliberate. The shadows of the kitchen offered a thin veil of protection, but as she shifted her weight, her elbow brushed the edge of a metal shelf. A heavy cast-iron skillet, perched precariously, slid off the edge. It hit the floor with a deafening, metallic gong that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. The sound ripped through the air like a gunshot, and Martha froze, her breath catching in her throat as the vibration of the iron slowly died away. In the dining room, the voices stopped instantly. A suffocating silence rushed in, broken only by the faint, receding hum of the skillet. Martha saw Thomas Miller's silhouette sharpen in the doorway's sliver of light, and a prickly, electric chill of pure terror raced down her spine. Thomas Miller slowly turned his head toward the kitchen, his eyes narrowing into two frigid, predatory slits. The yellow light from the diner's main hall cast Martha's long, distorted shadow directly across the kitchen floor, betraying her presence with agonizing clarity. The mayor took a deliberate step forward, his face contorting into a mask of cold fury as the reality of her eavesdropping took hold. He didn't speak. He simply pointed a long finger toward the shadows where she stood. Behind him, the council members scrambled to their feet, the screech of chairs on linoleum sounding like a chorus of dying animals. Martha saw the mayor's jaw set into a hard, uncompromising line. In that look, she saw the calculation of a man who viewed a witness as nothing more than a loose thread to be burned away. The air in the room grew heavy and stagnant, thick with the silent, mounting threat radiating from the man in the doorway. Martha bolted through the back door, her shoulders slamming into the frame as she burst into the biting night air. She nearly tripped over the rusted metal trash bins, her boots scrabbling for purchase on the loose gravel of the alley. She ran, her lungs burning, not daring to look back at the diner. The pale, flickering light of the street lamps cast long, frightening shadows against the familiar fences of her neighbors, making the town feel like a distorted labyrinth. She felt the heat of an imaginary gaze pressing against the back of her neck, the frantic rhythm of her own footsteps sounding like a dozen men in pursuit. When she finally reached the safety of her porch, her hands shook so violently that she dropped her keys twice, the metal clinking against the wooden boards. She lunged inside, sliding the heavy deadbolt home and pressing her forehead against the cool, solid wood of the door, her breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps. The first gray light of dawn was just beginning to touch the spire of the town hall when Martha stood before the imposing doors of the police station. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her old leather bag, which contained a notebook filled with the hurried, jagged notes she had scribbled of Miller's conversation. Inside, the station smelled of industrial floor wax and stale, burnt coffee. A duty officer sat behind a glass partition, his eyes glazed as he picked at a crossword puzzle. Martha took a deep, shuddering breath, preparing to pour out the truth about the corruption, the secret mall, and the mayor's plan to raise the town. The harsh, flickering light of the overhead fluorescent tubes reflected off the polished linoleum, highlighting the gray exhaustion on her face. She took a determined step toward the counter, her heart heavy with a desperate, flickering hope. Martha opened her mouth to speak, but the heavy thud of boots in the hallway made her turn. Sheriff James Miller stepped out of a side office, his face breaking into a wide, genuine grin as he saw his guest. Thomas Miller walked toward his brother with an easy, confident stride, and the two men embraced, clapping each other on the back with the easy familiarity of blood. The sheriff laughed at some private joke the mayor whispered, and Martha watched as Thomas Miller cast a brief, predatory glance over his brother's shoulder directly at her. The words she had prepared turned to ash in her mouth, a bitter, choking lump that blocked her throat. The hope she had carried into the station dissolved, replaced by a crushing weight of realization. She backed away toward the exit, her movements slow and mechanical, as the icy grip of hopelessness settled over her. Martha stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the bright morning sun that now felt like a cruel, artificial spotlight. The town continued its morning ritual. Cars hummed down the main street, shopkeepers rolled out awnings. But all Martha saw were the invisible chains linking the law to the men in power. Every patrol car that cruised past felt like a weapon in the mayor's arsenal. The knowledge that the sheriff and the mayor were two heads of the same beast made her clutch her bag tighter against her chest. There was no sanctuary left in Selma Creek for a woman with the truth. Not when the men sworn to protect the peace were the ones writing the secret history of its destruction. A profound loneliness washed over her, a cold tide rising amidst the bustle of the waking streets. Martha returned to her diner, where the heavy cast-iron skillet still lay on the kitchen floor, a silent witness to the previous night. She reached down and lifted the cold, heavy metal, feeling its familiar weight and the solid, unyielding reality of it. Her gaze drifted to the empty booths, the sunlight highlighting the layers of dust she hadn't yet wiped away. She wasn't just holding a piece of cookware. She was holding the last remnant of a life that was currently being bargained away in wood-paneled offices. The silence of the diner felt different now, not peaceful, but expectant, like a held breath before a storm. Martha stood frozen at the entrance of her own business, her eyes locked onto the neon yellow sheet of paper plastered to the front glass. It had been slapped right over the handwritten daily specials. The fresh adhesive still smelled of sharp chemicals, and the bold, blocky black letters of the official notice screamed about critical sanitary violations and the immediate cessation of operations. She reached out, her fingertips tracing the rough, industrial paper, feeling the cold fury vibrating beneath her skin. The red municipal seal looked like a fresh, bleeding wound against the familiar wood of the door. A few locals slowed their pace as they walked by, casting sideways, judgmental glances at the notice before hurrying away. Martha heard the distinct, double click of the lock at the hair salon next door, a sound that felt like the town turning its back on her in a single, synchronized motion. Inside, Sanitary Inspector Fox moved with a clinical, unhurried pace, his starched white coat rustling as he circled the stainless steel prep tables. Martha threw open the heavy doors of the walk-in refrigerator, revealing a pristine interior and ice bins without a single speck of dust. But the inspector's eyes never left his digital tablet. His stylus made rhythmic, decisive tapping sounds as he checked off boxes in the violations column. Martha held out her temperature logs, the ink neat and consistent. But Fox pointedly looked away, choosing instead to study a microscopic hairline crack in a ceiling tile. He ripped a slip of paper from his book, the fine for structural instability reaching 5 figures. Martha saw the man's meaty fingers trembling as he handed her the ticket. But he kept his gaze fixed on the wall behind her, refusing to acknowledge the woman whose livelihood he was dismantling. Martha climbed the weathered wooden steps of the O'Connor house, her hand tight around a folder filled with blank signature lines. She hammered her fist against the heavy oak door 3 times, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. From deep within the house, she heard a frantic scuttle of footsteps and the muffled, urgent hiss of a whisper. The lace curtain in the front window twitched for a second, revealing the wide, terrified eyes of her neighbor before he vanished back into the shadows. The sharp, mechanical snap of a deadbolt sliding home felt like a door slamming in her face. Martha stood alone on the porch, the silence of the street pressing in on her. She moved to the next house, but the porch light died the moment her foot touched the first step. The town was drowning in a thick, suffocating silence that made her own heavy breathing sound like a roar. A sudden, violent crash of shattering glass tore through the night, jolting Martha from the vinyl booth where she had been dozing. Shards of the front display window lay scattered across the linoleum like a sea of broken diamonds, catching the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp. Amidst the transparent rubble, she spotted a heavy gray brick wrapped in a crumpled page of the local newspaper. Martha picked it up, her fingers staining with the fresh, oily smell of newsprint. She unfolded the paper to find a hand-scrawled number, a buyout offer that didn't even cover the cost of her kitchen equipment. The sharp, acrid scent of a spent match tossed in through the hole tickled her nose. She clutched the scrap of paper to her chest, staring out through the jagged hole where her window used to be, feeling the biting wind of the night rush in to fill the room. Martha pushed open the heavy glass door of the pharmacy, the familiar chime of the bell sounding like a desperate plea. The air inside was a thick cocktail of camphor, dried peppermint, and sterile floor wax, the old floorboards groaning under her weight. Henry Walker stood behind the high, dark wood counter, his movements methodical as he lined up brown glass apothecary jars in perfect alphabetical order. Martha took a tentative step forward, catching her own reflection in the mirrored display cases. She looked gray, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. Henry didn't look up, his attention seemingly fixed on a stack of labels, though Martha could see the unnatural tension in his thin shoulders. The air between them felt thick and stagnant, and she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, trying to force the old man to meet her eyes. Henry suddenly turned his back to her, retreating into the deep shadows of the floor-to-ceiling shelving units filled with cough syrups and tinctures. Martha began to speak, her voice low and urgent, detailing Thomas Miller's bribes and the looming destruction of their history. Henry cut her off with a dry, mechanical cough that didn't reach his eyes. His voice was a flat drone as he began to parrot the mayor's talking points about new job opportunities and the necessary investment the mall would bring to their dying town. Martha watched his long fingers nervously twitch at his bow tie, his gaze stubbornly fixed on anything but her. Every word he spoke about inevitable progress felt like a heavy stone being piled between them, crushing a friendship that had spanned 30 years. She realized then that the pharmacist had built a barricade of glass bottles between himself and the truth. Martha descended the narrow, creaking stairs into the basement of the city archives, where the smell of damp rot and disintegrating paper made her throat tighten. A single, naked bulb flickered overhead, casting long, jerky shadows across the endless rows of gray cardboard boxes. She moved through the aisles, her fingers trailing over the spines of folders until they stopped on a thick file labeled Central District Structural Integrity. On the final page, her breath hitched as she saw the familiar, elegant script of Henry Walker's signature. It was scrawled directly beneath a recommendation for immediate demolition. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of her flashlight as she read the fabricated reports about irreparable foundation defects in buildings that had stood for a century. The chill of the basement concrete seemed to seep through the soles of her boots, settling deep in her bones. She turned the brittle page and found a carbon copy of a property transfer for the pharmacy's back warehouse. In the box for the new owner, a shell corporation was listed, but the fine print named Henry Walker as a consultant with a salary that made her stomach churn. The dates were the worst part. The signatures were inked months before Thomas Miller had ever mentioned the mall to the public. The heat of the betrayal burned more fiercely than the mayor's open threats. The old reports in her hands rattled, the sound like dry leaves under the feet of a man who had sold his soul. The safety of the library and her own diner had been bartered away by the town's most trusted healer for a slice of a concrete ghost. Martha burst onto the town square, where the air was already thick with the blue, oily exhaust of idling heavy trucks. A crew of workers in neon orange vests were hammering the first steel posts for a chain-link fence, cordoning off the library. Martha ran toward a massive bulldozer, her hands slamming against the cold, mud-slicked metal of its blade. The engine's vibration rattled her teeth, and the roar of the machinery drowned out her protests about building codes and historical preservation. The workers exchanged bored glances, one of them spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the pavement before roughly shoving her aside. She stumbled, the sharp gravel biting into her palms, but she scrambled back up, placing her body directly between the machine and the library's stone steps. The door of a sleek black limousine clicked open, and Thomas Miller stepped onto the sidewalk, his movements fluid as he adjusted his silk cuffs. He surveyed the disheveled Martha with a look of theatrical pity before letting out a sharp, barking laugh that drew the attention of the gathering crowd. Miller addressed the onlookers, pointing a gold-ringed finger at Martha and calling her a delusional recluse who was standing in the way of their children's future. His assistants joined in the laughter, and Martha saw the townspeople begin to whisper among themselves, their heads nodding in a slow, rhythmic agreement with power. Miller made a sweeping, cinematic gesture toward the library, promising a high-tech cinema in its place, and Martha felt herself shrinking under the weight of his mocking, public smile. The mayor's assistants began prying open large cardboard boxes, and a line immediately formed among the bystanders. Martha recognized them all. Mrs. Watkins, Bob the mailman, the young Stevens couple. They reached out with hungry, eager hands for glossy coupons promising free meals and discounts at the future Golden Mile. Martha tried to catch Mrs. Watkins's eye, but the woman looked down, clutching a gift bag embossed with the mall's logo as if it were a holy relic. The festive hum of the crowd, happily accepting the mayor's bribes, felt louder and more painful than the construction engines. She stood on the periphery, a ghost in her own town, watching decades of loyalty evaporate in the face of cheap plastic trinkets and the promise of a free sandwich. Martha walked back into her diner and slid every bolt into place, the wind still whistling through the jagged hole in her front window. The interior was a graveyard of her life. Broken glass, overturned chairs, and the lingering scent of fear. She sat down on the floor in the center of the room, her back against the counter where Henry used to sit every morning. The town outside was silent, but it was the silence of a predator waiting for the kill. She stared at the empty space where the life of Selma Creek used to pulse, realizing she was now the only thing standing in the way of the bulldozers. Martha reached for the wall-mounted telephone to call a repairman, but her hand met only the cold, flat surface of the wood. She looked down, seeing the jagged, frayed ends of the copper wire where the cord had been violently ripped from the wall. The white paint was marred by a series of greasy, dark smudges left by a stranger's hands. She picked up the plastic receiver, but instead of the reassuring hum of a dial tone, there was only a dead, hollow silence that seemed to echo her own isolation. A sharp, cold sweat broke out on her neck as she realized her only link to the outside world had been severed with a single, brutal tug. Outside, a faint, mocking laugh drifted on the wind. But inside the diner, the only sound was the grinding of her own teeth. She slammed her foot onto the brake pedal as the truck rounded a sharp, sun-dappled curve on the old forest road. But the pedal hit the floor with a sickeningly soft thud. Martha's heart did a violent somersault in her chest, and the cabin was suddenly filled with the sharp, chemical stench of leaking hydraulic fluid. The thick wall of pines on either side of the road blurred into a frantic green smear as the truck began to pick up speed. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles were white, her breath coming in short, panicked stabs. The sound of gravel drumming against the undercarriage became a roar as she made the split-second decision to steer into the dense undergrowth of the embankment. The world exploded into the sound of snapping branches and the screech of twisting metal, and the seatbelt yanked the air from her lungs as she was thrown forward. She shoved the buckled door open with her shoulder and tumbled onto the damp, needle-covered earth, her palms stinging as grit ground into the fresh scrapes. Martha looked up, catching a glimpse in the shattered side mirror of a black SUV idling at the top of the ridge. The tinted windows were like sheets of obsidian, but the silhouettes of the mayor's men were unmistakable against the light. After a long, terrifying beat, the vehicle roared to life, kicking up a cloud of foul-smelling exhaust as it sped away. Martha watched the red taillights vanish, her hands curling into fists so tight that her nails drew blood from her already wounded skin. The forest was suddenly very quiet, save for the ticking of her cooling engine. Martha pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bank, the blast of conditioned air chilling the sweat on her grime-streaked face. The clerk behind the counter adjusted his tie with a nervous twitch, refusing to meet her eyes as he slid a formal document across the polished mahogany. She saw her name at the top, followed by a bold, red stamp indicating a total freeze on all her business and personal accounts. The man's voice was a practiced, bloodless drone as he cited a pending investigation into tax irregularities as the reason for the lock. Martha slammed her hand onto the counter, the sound echoing in the sterile lobby. But the clerk simply pointed toward the door, where a security guard had already started to move. The sudden, total emptiness of her bank balance felt as cold and vast as the indifference of the man behind the glass. She walked down the center of the sidewalk, her bruised arm held tight against her ribs, feeling the weight of 1,000 silent judgments. Mrs. Holloway, who had spent every Friday afternoon in Martha's diner for 20 years, suddenly developed an intense interest in a display of rusted garden rakes in the hardware store window. Bob the mailman ducked into a narrow alleyway the moment he saw her, his head down as he fumbled with a stack of envelopes. The air around her seemed to drop 20 degrees. People moved aside, creating a physical vacuum of fear and awkwardness. Martha heard the sharp, urgent whispers behind her. But when she turned, there were only the retreating backs of people she had known her entire life. Each chime of a shop door closing felt like a gavel striking a final sentence. Martha opened the door to her back office and froze, finding Billy hunched over her open floor safe. The young waiter was frantically stuffing a blue accordion folder into the front of his jacket, the folder that held the original building inspections and the archive notes. Billy's face went a sickly shade of white, his eyes wide with a panicked, animal light as he saw her in the doorway. She saw his hands shaking, the same hands she had taught to carry a tray and had given extra shifts to when his mother was sick. On the desk, a stack of crisp, new $100 bills sat in the spill of a knocked-over lamp, the bribe money looking garish and wrong. The room smelled of old paper and the cheap, spicy cologne the boy always wore, a scent that now made her stomach turn. Billy lunged forward, his shoulder catching Martha in the chest and knocking her backward. She hit the floor hard, her elbow cracking against the desk leg, as the boy scrambled past her and out through the rear exit. The blue folder was clutched to his chest like a prize, and Martha knew with a sickening certainty that her best evidence was walking out the door. The heavy metal door slammed shut, the sound vibrating through the small room like a final bell. She tried to push herself up, her fingers sliding on a few stray, empty envelopes Billy had left behind. But he was already gone into the maze of alleys behind the main street. The office was suddenly, agonizingly quiet, filled only with the smell of his betrayal. She knelt in the dark corner of the pantry, shoving aside dusty boxes of napkins and stacks of faded tablecloths. Her fingers finally closed around the cold, pebbled plastic of an old micro-cassette recorder. Its surface, buried under a thick layer of gray, felt like dust. Martha blew the grit away, her breath hitching as she pressed the play button. A harsh, static-filled hiss filled the small space. And then, cutting through the noise, Thomas Miller's voice emerged, thin and distorted, but unmistakably his. She listened to him promise to crush that old woman into the dirt if she didn't take the buyout. The tape groaned as it turned, the mechanical whine a testament to its age. But every syllable of the threat burned into Martha's mind. It was a fragile, electronic ghost of the truth. But it was the only weapon she had left. Martha pulled a heavy, leather-bound album from a hidden niche behind the water heater, its copper corners cold against her skin. On the thick, cream-colored pages, the stern faces of Selma Creek's founders stared back at her through the fog of history. She traced the edges of a group photograph from 1920, where Miller's own grandfather stood shoulder to shoulder with the town's first librarian, signing a pledge of public trust. The album smelled of old vanilla and wood smoke, a scent that seemed to carry the weight of a century. She saw the signatures not as ink, but as a blood oath that the current mayor was preparing to violate. Martha pressed the book against her chest, the physical weight of it feeling like a shield against the greed that was eating the town from the inside out. The sheriff stepped into her path on the sidewalk, his broad chest blocking the sun and casting a long, dark shadow over the dusty pavement. The silver badge on his uniform caught the light, momentarily blinding her with a sharp, metallic glint. He moved with a slow, deliberate heaviness as he unfolded a legal document, his voice a flat, rehearsed monotone as he read a restraining order. Martha was officially barred from the Oak Festival grounds on the grounds of preventing public disturbance. She watched his hand rest casually on the grip of his service weapon, a silent, mounting threat that needed no words. The justification of public safety felt like a mockery as he stared her down with eyes that were as cold and unyielding as flint. Martha sat at the bar in her darkened diner, the only light coming from a single, flickering candle in a tin saucer. The shadows of the empty stools danced against the walls like a crowd of silent ghosts. On the counter, the small speaker of the recorder continued to hiss, the mayor's threats punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic clicks of the ancient tape. She picked up a glass of water, her hand trembling so much that the liquid sloshed over the rim, soaking into the wood. The town outside was quiet, but it was the quiet of a fuse burning toward a powder keg. Martha moved through the jagged gap in the back fence, the rusted iron groaning softly as she slipped past the overgrown ivy. The thorns of a wild rose bush snagged the sleeve of her heavy coat, a sharp reminder of the world she was trying to save. But she didn't slow down. She kept her elbow clamped tight against the thick, leather-bound album and the small recorder hidden in her pocket. The ground beneath her boots was a soup of rotting leaves and fallen apples, their sweet, fermenting scent thick in the damp air. She crouched behind the massive, gnarled trunk of the great oak at the edge of the square, watching the colorful flags of the festival flutter in the distance. The wind carried the brassy, hollow notes of a marching band, and Martha's fingers, stained with the soot of the alleyways, checked the latch on her bag one last time. Thomas Miller bounded up the steps of the wooden stage, his smile a blinding, artificial white that seemed to reflect the mid-afternoon sun. The sharp click of his expensive shoes on the plywood sounded like a countdown as he approached the podium, which was draped in the blue and gold silk of the town's colors. A roar of approval rose from the crowd, a single thunderous wave of sound that seemed to push the air out of Martha's lungs. Miller raised his arms like a conqueror, his shadow stretching long across the gathered townspeople. The air around the stage was a thick mix of expensive cologne and the smell of fresh lumber. And as he adjusted the microphone, the feedback hummed with a low, expectant energy. Martha burst from behind the heavy red velvet curtain like a gray specter, her sudden appearance cutting through the bright festival lights. Miller's voice died in his throat, his mouth hanging open in a silent, stunned "oh" as she lunged for the podium. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of kitchen work, gripped the cold steel of the microphone stand with a strength that surprised even her. The screech of the metal bass dragging across the floorboards was a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the celebratory atmosphere. She yanked the microphone from its clip, the plastic snapping with a sharp crack, and stood at the very edge of the stage. Her breath came in heavy, ragged hitches, the sound amplified into a low, rhythmic thrum by the massive speakers. She threw the heavy album onto the podium, the leather cover hitting the wood with a thud that sent a small cloud of dust into the air. Martha's voice, when it finally came, wasn't the voice of the diner owner they knew. It was a cold, iron-hard rasp that demanded attention. She began to read the 1920 oath, her fingers stabbing at the yellowed parchment as she looked directly at the first row of seats. She saw Mrs. Stevens clutch her pearls, her face turning a pale, sickly green, while Judge Holt looked down at his shoes as if they were the most interesting thing in the world. Every word she spoke about the sacred trust of the founders felt like a hammer blow against the silence of the square, forcing the crowd to look at the history they were about to pave over. Martha reached into her pocket and slammed the small recorder against the microphone's head. The square fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence, broken only by the thin, mechanical hiss of the tape. Then, Thomas Miller's voice erupted from the speakers, distorted and booming, filled with a casual, predatory cruelty. The townspeople froze as they heard their mayor talk about clearing out the trash and squeezing the life out of the local businesses. Miller took a staggering step back, his face turning a mottled, bruised purple as he looked for an escape that wasn't there. Martha stood perfectly still, watching the recording of his own greed shatter the carefully constructed image of the man on the stage. The sheriff made a sudden, violent move toward her, his boots thundering on the hollow stage as his hand went for the heavy metal cuffs at his belt. At that exact moment, two white vans with the bold logos of the regional news station screeched to a halt at the edge of the square, kicking up a storm of dust and discarded flyers. Reporters in sharp jackets leaped out before the vehicles had even stopped, their cameras rising to their shoulders like high-tech weapons. The sheriff froze, his hand hovering over his belt, as the sudden glare of professional flashes and the sight of a dozen lenses pointed at his chest stopped him cold. The assistants of the mayor scrambled backward, tripping over equipment as the media swarm surged toward the stage, turning a potential arrest into a televised event. Henry Walker stepped out from the deep shadows of the town hall's stone columns, his SWAT posture gone, replaced by a stiff, painful dignity. He walked past Thomas Miller without a glance, the mayor looking at him with the wide, desperate eyes of a drowning man. Henry placed a stack of blue folders on the podium, the paper tied with a simple, frayed string. His voice was thin and shook with emotion, but it carried to the back of the square as he confessed to the forged reports and the pressure from the mayor's office. Martha watched as he reached out a hand to her, a gesture of quiet, broken redemption. As a gust of wind caught the top sheet of the original blueprints, it sailed over the crowd, a white flag of truth drifting over the silent townspeople. A low, guttural murmur rose from the crowd, quickly escalating into a chorus of sharp whistles and angry shouts. Mrs. Watkins stepped forward, her face twisted with a sudden, sharp clarity as she pulled the Golden Mile coupon from her bag. She crumpled the glossy paper into a hard ball and threw it with a sharp, flicking motion, the paper bouncing off the mayor's silk lapel. Within seconds, a rain of promotional flyers, plastic keychains, and free hats filled the air, pelting the stage like a storm of colorful hail. Miller backed away toward the rear of the platform, his hands up as if to ward off the physical weight of the town's rejection. Two black sedans with government plates screeched to a halt at the base of the stairs, cutting off the mayor's only path to his waiting limo. Men in dark, anonymous suits moved up the steps with a silent, practiced efficiency, their silver badges glinting in the afternoon light. The lead agent held a document in front of Miller's face, the words "federal indictment" and "racketeering" cutting through the noise like a blade. Miller tried to speak, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine, but his arms were already being jerked behind his back. The sharp, metallic double click of the handcuffs closing around his wrists was the final sound of his career, echoing over a square that had finally stopped shouting. Martha slowly closed the leather album, her fingers lingering on the cool copper corners before she tucked it back under her arm. She stepped off the stage, and the crowd of neighbors and strangers parted before her like a retreating tide. She walked through the center of the square, past Mrs. Watkins and Bob the mailman, whose faces were filled with a mixture of awe and a deep, biting shame. A few people reached out to touch her sleeve, their voices murmuring apologies, but Martha didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the street ahead, feeling the cold, invisible wall that now stood between her and the people who had been willing to watch her burn for a free sandwich. Martha pushed open the door to her diner, the bell giving a lonely, singular ring that seemed to vibrate in the empty room. She looked at the front window, where the yellow violation notice still clung to the glass, and she reached out, her nail catching the edge. She ripped the paper away in one long, jagged motion, leaving only a few sticky smears behind. Outside, the massive yellow excavators were already being loaded onto trailers, their engines growling as they began the slow crawl out of Selma Creek. The roar of the machines faded into the distance, leaving the town to a silence that felt heavy and permanent. Martha stood behind her counter, the smell of old coffee and bleach the only things left in a world that had become very, very quiet.